Crystal thought she had moved on from her ex-husband Paul's betrayal, but when he calls asking for help during his cancer treatment, her world is turned upside down. Can she support him for their son's sake without reopening old wounds? Crystal divorced Paul more than a year ago, and every time his name pops up in an email from school about their son Christopher, she keeps telling herself that she has moved on. She had lived with the knowledge that he had betrayed her, and that the man with whom she once shared love had fallen for someone else during the most vulnerable chapter of their lives together. But now Paul's back, and he needs her help. It started like most days, the usual shuffle of getting Christopher off to school and the mental rundown of daily chores. Crystal had carved out a comfortable life if you ignored the hollow space where Paul's love once was. She liked to believe that she had moved on, that the divorce was painful, but necessary to move forward to a better life for her and her son. But it sometimes was an ache in places she thought had healed. The internal struggle was a constant companion, a silent battle she fought daily. Warm morning light bathed the kitchen, the soft humming of the dishwasher whirring softly through the air. Crystal sat at the table, her coffee in her hand, scrolling absent-mindedly through her phone. She wasn't prepared for the jolt of panic that would shoot through her when a name she tried to forget lit up on her screen. It was as if the ground beneath her had shifted, and she was left reeling in the sudden disruption of her life. Her thumb hovered over the screen as her heart raced in her chest. Why was he calling her now? The only contact they'd had since the divorce was a couple of emails and texts about Christopher, nothing more. They'd agreed to keep things amicable for their son's sake, but that didn't prepare her to hear his voice. Her thumb swiped open the call before she convinced herself it was better to leave it on voicemail. "Hello?" Her voice came out shakier than she wanted. There was a short moment of dead air on the other end of the line, and she almost felt Paul's hesitation. When he finally spoke, his strained voice was heavy with something indiscernible. "Crystal, I have no right to ask anything but must talk to you. It's essential." Crystal shut her eyes, tightening her hold on her coffee cup. "What is it, Paul?" "It's cancer. It's come back." Those 4 words seemed to hang there, thick and heavy, threatening to suffocate her. Crystal's mind reeled with a flood of memories, hospitals, doctor's appointments, the months spent taking care of him for the first time. She had given up everything, her job, social life, and sanity, only for him to betray her. She felt a knot form in her stomach as her mind tried to digest everything he said. "Paul, I'm so sorry to hear that, but I don't see what this has to do with me." He let his breath out in a noisy, long, wearied sound, and for a moment, despite herself, a pang of sympathy pulled at her heart. "Crystal, I need help. I need a place to stay while I go through treatment. It's only for a few months." Crystal's breath caught in her throat. "You want to stay here? After everything? I know how it sounds, but I have no one else. Gladys is gone. She left a few months ago. My parents can't handle it, and I can't afford to stay elsewhere." The name Gladys provided that familiar surge of bitterness in her chest. Gladys was the woman who had stolen Paul from her. He had turned to her during their marriage during the most drear of times while Crystal sat home, tending him and holding their family together. Bitterness is still complex after all this time. Crystal's voice turned hard. "So now you want me to pick up the pieces again, after you walked out on me for her?" Paul's voice cracked. "It's not like that. I'm asking for Christopher's sake. He deserves to have his father around, even if it's just for a little while." Crystal bit her lip as the weight of his words sank in. Christopher was the only one she had ever placed first, even when her world had come crashing down around her. How could she grudge him for the opportunity to get close to his father at a time so crucial? Yet, the thought of giving Paul an entry into her life, her home, made her stomach churn. "I need time to think about this," she said, her voice tight. "Of course," Paul replied, his tone softening. "Take as long as you need. I'm sorry to even ask. I wouldn't if there was another way." They hung up, and Crystal set her phone down, staring blankly at the kitchen counter. Her coffee had gone cold, but she didn't care. She felt numb, like the ground had shifted under her feet, and she wasn't sure how to find her footing again. Days turned into weeks as Crystal agonized over the decision. The past sacrifice she had made for so many years, the sleepless nights by Paul's bedside in the hospital, the hurt of finding him with Gladys, just would not release her. She had thought that as time wore on, the wounds were healing, but they kept surfacing, clamoring to be acknowledged. She started trying to distract herself, filling her days with work and errands, but it did no good. The weight of Paul's request hung over her like a cloud. No amount of busy work would remove it. Dawn, her friend of many years since college, had been her rock through the divorce. She had seen Crystal at her worst and helped put her life back together. So it was no surprise when the evening brought Dawn to her door with wine and a sympathetic ear. "You look like you've been through the ringer," Dawn said, handing Crystal a glass of red as they settled onto the couch. "What's going on?" Crystal let out a deep sigh, running a hand through her hair. "It's Paul. He's sick again." Dawn's expression changed from one of concern to one of anger. "And let me guess, he wants you to care for him?" "Not precisely," Crystal said, swirling the wine in her glass. "But he needs a place to stay while he's going through treatment. He can't afford to stay elsewhere, and his parents are not an option." Dawn let out an incredulous laugh. "So now he just expects you to drop everything and invite him to waltz back into your life after what he did?" "I know," Crystal replied, frustration by now a familiar surge flooding over her. "But it's complicated. Christopher needs his dad, and if Paul's really as sick as he says he is, I don't know what to do, Dawn. I don't want to hurt my son." Dawn's expression gentled. "You've always put Christopher first, Crystal, but you also need to think about yourself. You've already sacrificed so much for Paul. You don't owe him anything." Crystal nodded, but the tightness in her belly wouldn't ease. Dawn was right. She didn't owe Paul anything. Yet the thought of Christopher losing a father, of going through life without that connection, made the weight of what she was considering sink hard into her gut. Could she really live with that guilt? 2 weeks later, Paul moved into the guest room. It was not a decision taken lightly, but in the end, Crystal's love for Christopher won out. She had set boundaries with Paul. He was there for treatment and nothing else. She was not his caregiver anymore, and she had made it clear. Even with those boundaries firmly set, Crystal could not shake off the strain that seemed to seep deep into her bones when Paul stepped back into her home. It was as though the walls had shrunk too. The house was now claustrophobic, filled with memories and ghosts she so thought she had left behind. Christopher was in seventh heaven, though. He'd missed his daddy, and getting him back, however fleetingly, was just too good to be true. He hadn't been able to grasp the severity of Paul's illness, and Crystal wasn't yet sure she wanted him to. For the moment, she let him bask in his reunion. But to Crystal, the days felt long and awkward. Paul mostly shut himself in the guest room or went to the hospital for treatment. The house was silent, but it was a loaded silence, one filled with all the things they were not saying to each other. The evening had fallen, and Crystal sat folding laundry in the living room when Paul appeared in the doorway, pale and drawn. The treatments had taken his vigor, and he was worn and tired now. For an instant, Crystal did feel that old sympathy she used to think for him back when she used to be his anchor through the first round of cancer. "Can we talk?" Paul asked softly. Crystal put down the laundry basket and shut it down inside. She knew this was a talk she had been avoiding and could no longer avoid. "What is it?" she asked, her tone unconcerned. Paul nervously fidgeted with the couch's edge before lowering himself onto it, his hands clasped firmly in his lap. He stared at the floor in what appeared to be an attempt to gather strength to speak. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, strained. "About everything. About how much I hurt you. I know I said that before, but I'm sorry, Crystal, for everything." Crystal's stomach twisted. She'd heard this apology before the affair had come to light after he'd begged her to give him another chance. But at the time, the words seemed empty, as if they were a desperate attempt to rescue something beyond repair. She wrapped her arms around herself and tucked her emotions inside. "Why now, Paul? Why bring all this up again?" "Because I can't live with it no more," he said, his voice cracking. "I have been trying to make sense of what I did, and the truth is I can't. I can't justify it. I was scared, and I did something unforgivable. I thought I was dying, and I made the worst decision of my life." A lump had risen to Crystal's throat, but she made herself not respond. She had been working long to overcome it and leave the deceit behind. She did not want to reopen old wounds. "I appreciate the apology," she said, the voice tight, "but that doesn't change what happened." "I know," Paul said, his eyes pleading. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just needed to say it. I needed you to know that I am sorry for everything." Crystal looked away as her mind whirled with emotions she didn't want to face. She once had loved Paul profoundly and passionately. The love, however, had been destroyed, and no number of apologies could put the pieces back together. They sat silent for a long while, the history of their relationship. Then, she spoke in a clear and forthright voice, her tone even. "I am not here for you, Paul. I'm here because of Christopher. He needs his father to be around him, but that's all. When your treatment is over, you'll have to move out, and we will go back to living our separate lives again." Paul nodded, slumping back defeatedly. "I understand. Thanks for letting me stay, even if it's only for a little while." Crystal said nothing. She couldn't. It had taken too much emotionally out of her, and now she just wanted the chapter to be over and done with. The following weeks morphed into a blur, a string of hospital visits combined with silent, strained evenings at home. The treatments Paul received were brutal. Crystal found herself slipping back into old patterns, making sure he was comfortable, checking on him when he didn't come downstairs to eat. Her body had gone on autopilot, reverting to its old role despite her best intentions of keeping her distance. But this time, the emotional burden was heavier. Crystal's anger flared up every time she saw him weak and vulnerable. He'd broken her heart. Again, she was called upon to hold everything together. One afternoon, Christopher came home from school pale and anxious. "Mom, is Dad going to die?" It felt like Crystal had been punched in the gut. She knelt down beside her son and placed her hands on his shoulders. "Why do you ask that, sweetheart?" Chris's eyes welled up with tears. "Some of the kids at school were talking about cancer. They said people die from it. I don't want Dad to die." Crystal pulled him into a hug, her heart breaking for him. "Your dad is sick, but the doctors are doing everything they can to help him. He's fighting hard, and we're going to keep supporting him. But right now, he needs us to be strong." Christopher nodded, wiping his eyes. "I'll be strong, Mom. I promise." Crystal leaned over and kissed his head, fighting the urge to let her tears flow. She wished she could assure him everything would be okay, but she didn't know. Paul's prognosis was indeterminate, the future looming darkly ahead. One evening, several weeks into the treatment, Paul collapsed in the hallway. Crystal was the first to find him, her heart racing, and she called for an ambulance. A few minutes later, some paramedics arrived and whisked him away to the hospital. At the same time, Crystal and Christopher followed in her car. The next few hours were the worst. Crystal sat in the hospital's waiting room, clutching Christopher's hand and waiting for news. Worst-case scenarios ran through her head as images of Paul's first battle with cancer flashed before her eyes. She had been by his side then, but this time felt different. There was a finality to it this time that she couldn't seem to shake. Crystal's heart leaped into her throat when the doctor finally came out. "He's stable for now," the doctor said, his face grim. "But cancer is aggressive. We'll need to monitor him closely." Crystal nodded, her body sagging with a mix of both relief and fear. She had steeled herself for the worst, but the prospect of losing Paul still hit her like a freight train. Despite all he had done, despite the betrayal and pain, he was still Christopher's father, and some of her still cared about him, even if she didn't want to admit it. He was in the intensive care unit for another month in the hospital. Crystal visited him regularly with Christopher sometimes and alone sometimes, speaking little about everything except his recovery. Still, there lay a tentative peace between them. Finally, Paul was discharged, very weak, but doctors were optimistic concerning his long-term prognosis. He would have to come in every month for follow-up checkups and medication, but for the time being, he was out of the woods. The day Paul finally left her house for good was weird. There was no fanfare, no big dramatic goodbye, just quiet, mutual understanding that this chapter in their lives was over and done. Paul thanked her again. His voice was brimming with sincerity. Crystal nodded, finding closure in the action she hadn't expected. As Crystal watched his car disappear down the street, she felt an unusual mixture of emotions, relief, sadness, that gnawing feeling of what could have been. But above everything else, the weight was finally lifted off her shoulders. She knew she had done what she needed to do for Christopher's sake, and now it was time to move on. She stood on her porch, the cool evening breeze caressing her skin. The house was quiet, still in a way it hadn't been in months. She smiled to herself, a bittersweet feeling in her chest. Life was unpredictable, full of twists and turns she never could have imagined. But she'd made it through, stronger, wiser. And while shades of yesteryear still clung to her, she was ready to brave whatever came her way.